My name is Zhanna Nemtsova. I am the founder of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom. And this foundation I created in memory of my father. My father was Boris Nemtsov, a Russian opposition politician who was assassinated in Moscow in 2015. And after his assassination, I moved to Germany and created the Boris Nemtsov Foundation. The foundation has been doing a lot of work here in the Czech Republic, and we established the Boris Nemtsov Academic Center for the Study of Russia in cooperation with the Faculty of Arts at Charles University. And so because of my work for the foundation, and also because I'm a journalist, I used to be a journalist, now I don't do a lot of journalistic work, so I was selected as the Draper Hills Fellow at Stanford University in 2017. And it's a great program, by the way. I spent 3 weeks at Stanford in Palo Alto, and Professor Fukuyama was one of my mentors. And I liked that program so much, it inspired me so much that I decided that I would like to create a number of projects that would be structured as this school. And so we started our cooperation with Professor Fukuyama, and in 2019, I invited Professor Fukuyama for the Boris Nemtsov Forum in Warsaw, and I moderated a discussion between the professor and Alexei Navalny, whom you probably know. He is the Russian opposition politician who is now in jail. And then we decided to deepen our cooperation, and now we are here with the professors, not only with Professor Fukuyama, but also with Professor Jensen at Stanford for our joint event. And I'm honored to be invited here and honored to moderate this discussion. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Mr. Volndra.
First of all, once again, I want to thank you very much for helping us to bring our dear guest into Sevro for us in Sevro. It's really a great honor and joy, because I was teaching here for 8 years the course on the geopolitics, and one of the key lectures was under the title Fukuyama, Huntington, or Misheimer, who was right? And then, I pressed the students to vote at the end of this special lecture. And then they had the obligation to write a text simply to advocate their opinion. And it was very interesting because, when I was teaching this firstly throughout the 90s, you were always, victorious because the Czechs are skeptical by nature, but the 90s was the era of really joy, because we wake up into the freedom and we celebrated the liberalism by its original meaning. There was a different type of liberalism than is being marketed in the last couple of years. Then, of course, with the troubles, 9/11 and aftermath, Huntington was winning in my class. And then with the crisis, economic crisis coming in, 2008, 2009, and then, bringing back realism in the global stage. Even Misheimer as a proponent of the realpolitik is gaining a lot of vote in my class. But I have to admit, firstly, your critics said in the early 90s that, you are enjoying your 9 minutes of glory. But the fact is that 30 years has passed, and still in every debate in the world, about where we are, you are still being mentioned as, a man to discuss, and your end of history concept is still being broadly discussed. So it's fantastic, you know. It was 30 minutes of glory, and I cannot remember anybody else of those who were trying to define some concept of the world that would enjoy the same kind of attention. So for us, it's really an honor to finally have you here. I understand, you know, we were reading not just the end of the history, we were reading Trust, we were reading The Great Disruption. We are looking forward to your new book, Liberalism and Its Discontents. And I'm very glad that you would have a chance to introduce your thoughts, which we will be studying in details once the book would be available here. If you want, the essay is already, as always, available on the internet. So, again, thank you very much.
Okay.
And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in the Czech Republic. It's been quite a while. The last time that I was here, I actually met Václav Havel, so it means that it's more than 10 years ago, and it's been fascinating to follow the politics, not just in the Czech Republic, but in this region generally, because a lot of things that have happened in global politics have been reflected in the politics of Eastern Europe. But I'm very happy to be able to catch up with some old friends, and very grateful for the connection with Jana and for the opportunity this evening. So what I am going to talk about is my book that will be coming out next spring. The title is Liberalism and Its Discontents. It's a very straightforward purpose in writing this book. I regard myself as a classical liberal. I will define that momentarily. And I think that liberalism has come under attack in recent years and a kind of criticism that it had not been subject to earlier. I think that actually almost everybody up till recently thought of themselves as a liberal, and they took it for granted to such an extent that they didn't even think it needed to be defended. But now it's been attacked from both the right and the left. From the right, it's been criticized by these new populists who argue that liberalism is responsible for the decline of national identity, for globalization, for inequality, for a lot of the loss of culture that has occurred, they say, in many countries. And on the left, it's been attacked by a new progressive movement that feels that it's responsible for a lot of the economic injustice in the world. And these attacks are not just against liberal policies, they're against the very idea of liberalism. And it's for that reason that I thought it was necessary to help found an online journal called American Purpose. And the lead essay that I wrote when we started this a little more than a year ago was an essay called Liberalism and Its Discontents, but I've now turned this into a short book. So I'm just going to give you the argument, and hopefully that can open up a discussion about the merits. So by liberalism, I mean the doctrine that appeared in Europe in about the middle of the 17th century at the conclusion of the European wars of religion. And if you go back to those historical origins, I think that you can see really three arguments that were put forward over the centuries in favor of this doctrine. So liberalism is essentially a doctrine that says that human beings are individuals who are fundamentally equal in their moral capacities and ought to be treated equally in politics, that those rights that they bear should be protected by a rule of law and by a constitutional set of limitations on the power of states so that those individuals' rights are protected, and that it is a doctrine that is open to innovation and to new ideas and is capable of self-correction. I think those are the fundamental ideas, the universalism of rights and the belief that there's a kind of underlying human dignity that needs to be protected. I think that there are basically three arguments that have been put forward over the years in favor of liberalism. So I'm going to lay those out, and then I'm going to argue that those liberal principles have been distorted over the last couple of generations, and they've been carried to extremes on both the right and the left. And a lot of the discontents with liberalism are backlashes or reactions to those extreme interpretations of liberalism. But if we go back to the original meaning of liberalism, it's still a very valuable doctrine, and it's one that needs to be defended. So let me begin with the first of the justifications. The first is a pragmatic one. Liberalism appeared in the writings of people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in the wake of the European wars of religion, in which people were killing each other. And the 30 Years' War began in this country, and it led to the deaths of maybe a third of the population of Central Europe. But they were killing each other because they had differing visions of what the good life defined by religion was. So people would be burned at the stake for believing in transubstantiation. And what liberalism did was basically to say, look, we do not agree on the highest goals of man as defined by religion. We need to lower our sights. We need to focus on the ability to live together peacefully and in personal security. And the political order should not define the good life in those substantive terms. And so in that sense, liberalism is a very pragmatic doctrine meant to deal with diversity. People do not agree on the deepest things about human life. We accept that diversity and we create a system to mediate those. After the wars of religion, you had other divisions. So in the 19th century, you had the growth of European nationalism, which led to the two world wars. And again, Europe was divided between Germans and Czechs and French people and Italians and so forth, and they found that worth killing each other over. And the liberal order that appeared after 1945 was again a recognition that this kind of diversity needed to be managed under a liberal set of rules. And so the entire post-war order that was embodied in institutions like the WTO and like NATO were designed to protect constitutional liberal orders from each other and to make sure that the international order also reflected those liberal principles. And as such, it was an extremely successful international system. That's the first justification, so purely pragmatic. We don't want to kill each other over differing visions of the good life. The second argument is a moral one that has to do with the human capacity for choice. I think that the word dignity has been embedded in like the German Basic Law and the South African Constitution, the Japanese Constitution. Many modern liberal democracies recognize a right to dignity. I would say that most politicians in the democratic world wouldn't be able to define the meaning of dignity, but I think it is very deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition that sees human beings as capable of moral choice. Adam and Eve are ejected from the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis because they are told not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They do it anyway, and they express moral choice. They make the wrong choice. God casts them out, but at that point, human beings have this ability to make good choices and bad choices, and that distinguishes them from animals. It puts them in an intermediate moral status between natural creation and God. And that, I think, has been the basis of human dignity, the fact that we can be good, but we are not necessarily good, but we have this ability to make these choices. I think that Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation located that source of choice within each individual and created the notion that our inner autonomy is really what gives us the greatest personality and dignity. This was given a secular form both by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant. So the inner choice was detached from religion. It was detached from the Christian religion and was put forward simply as a human characteristic. So Kant's categorical imperative is a recognition of the ability of human beings to defy the laws of physics because they actually are capable of genuine choice, and that creates a rational set of rules of moral behavior on which Kantian morality is based. And I think that it's that belief that human beings are moral creatures that is the moral basis of a liberal regime, and that is what liberalism is designed to protect. Third justification is economic, because among the rights and that liberalism protected, the right to own property, the right to transact, was deeply embedded in the thinking of early liberals. Because of its protection of property rights and of contract, because of its emphasis on law, liberal societies became rich societies. The first two big liberal countries in Europe, the Netherlands and England, were the leaders of both the commercial revolution, and this included the Italian city-states and many other places that operated according to liberal principles. They became the engines of economic growth. Then the origins of the Industrial Revolution and the kind of prosperity that we enjoy living in the developed world today. And so liberalism became very closely associated with economic rights and the ability to own property. And I think basically those three justifications continue to be the main reasons why I believe I'm a liberal and why I think this is still a worthwhile doctrine. However, the doctrine has evolved over time, and I think that what's happened is that these starting principles had been taken to extremes that then create outcomes that are contrary to liberal principles, or produce outcomes that generate discontent, generate social discontent. On the right, the extreme was the way in which economic liberalism evolved into what is called neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism, oftentimes with a number of young people, is taken to be simply a synonym for capitalism. I think that's a wrong definition, because I think that, properly speaking, neoliberalism should be seen as a certain interpretation of economic liberalism that was associated with the rise of, let's say, the Chicago School, people like Milton Friedman and George Stigler and Gary Becker among economists, and then associated with politicians like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who first came to power in the late 70s and 1980s, who began with the correct premise that prosperity does begin with property rights and the protection of property rights, but they, in a sense, absolutized the market. The market became, in a way, an object of worship that was simply accepted ideologically rather than based on an observation of the empirical reality of the way market economies worked. And conversely, the state was demonized as an enemy of growth. The state was seen as something that was manipulated by elites that could get in the way of general prosperity. There were good reasons for this shift towards market economics in the 1970s, because a lot of inefficiencies had developed over time. Many economies were greatly overregulated, and so they needed this corrective away from the state and towards the market. But I think a lot of neoliberals began to worship the market itself, and they forgot that the state nonetheless plays extremely important roles, including the creation of a market itself. If you don't have a legal system, if you don't have property rights, and if you don't have state enforcement, you don't have capitalism. So capitalism actually requires a foundation of a state, and it requires the foundation of a modern state that is not corrupt, that is not subject to patronage, that is not captured by elites. And so it needs, in other words, a liberal state, and that's something that I think a lot of neoliberals neglected, and in the process created a globalized world that was very unequal. And so in virtually every modern capitalist country over the last 2 generations, you've had a startling rise in inequality. You have the rise of a lot of oligarchs and billionaires in almost every country, and you have a working class that in many places has been left behind, has seen their jobs move to China or Vietnam or Bangladesh or other developing countries, which has meant for them a loss of social status and a great deal of resentment at the elites that have gotten richer while their lives have stagnated. And that, I think, is one of the causes of the populist backlash that you've seen in many rich countries around the world, beginning with the United States voting for Donald Trump in 2016 and the British voting for Brexit in the same year. These were the 2 countries that led the neoliberal revolution, and I don't think it's an accident that they're the first 2 countries infected by this populist backlash on the part of people that hadn't been really included in the prosperity that had been created in the liberal world order in the preceding generation. So that was one set of extremes. The other set of extremes was more characteristic of the left and had to do with the absolutization of autonomy. So I think there's a common sense understanding of why autonomy is important. If you believe that human beings are capable of moral choice, and I believe that that is, that's simply a fact, you have to ask, what kinds of choices are they making? Do they simply have the ability to choose an pre-existing moral framework? That certainly would have been the opinion of Luther or virtually any other Christian thinker. Or does that moral autonomy extend to making up the moral framework itself? And as Western thought evolved in the 19th century, as societies secularized under the pressure of the Enlightenment and the rise of scientific rationalism, religion began to decline, and thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche began to say, well, human autonomy isn't simply your ability to obey the laws set by Christianity or by some other pre-existing framework. It is the ability to create that framework itself. The true moral autonomy is about making up the rules, your ability to make up the rules. And I think that this becomes very problematic because, among other things, having a common set of rules is what makes society possible. If we don't all drive on the same side of the street, we get into traffic accidents, and if we don't have a shared sense of right and wrong, then we don't have, a shared society. And so this absolutization of autonomy that you see in the work of, an Anglo-Saxon writer like John Rawls is fundamentally wrong. That autonomy is valued by most people because they want to live within a moral horizon. It's not valued as an end in itself. But that's the way that liberalism evolved, and so you had the belief that spread among many people that we are choosing individuals and there ought to be no constraints on the kind of moral choices that we can make. So that's problematic in itself. It leads to a kind of moral relativism that then begins to question the values underlying liberalism itself. But it takes a different form as time goes on, which eventually evolves into what we call modern identity politics. That when people begin to look at their choosing inner selves, they say, well, I'm not actually autonomous because I am treated by my society as a member of a racial minority, as a member of an ethnic minority, because I'm female, because I'm gay or lesbian, and all of a sudden, it is that inner identity that becomes the valuable thing that defines the self that needs to be protected by society. And this begins to then undermine the liberal belief in individuals as the agents on which society is built, that it's no longer our individual moral choices that define us, but rather our membership in groups of various sorts. Now, this is not something new in world politics. If you go to Bosnia, if you go to Afghanistan, if you go to Syria, you are living in societies in which these group identities are fundamental. As you can imagine, the politics in those countries being based on a zero-sum understanding of group identity is not very peaceful and not very happy. But you see a shift in the thinking of many liberals on the left in favor of group recognition over individual recognition. And this becomes particularly pronounced in a country like the United States, which has a long history of racial discrimination, in which, in fact, an important class of Americans, that is to say African Americans, were treated very, very differently because of their skin color. But this then becomes the ground for an assertion of rights not of individual people who happen to be black, but people, because they are black, you know, having a certain status and a certain set of group rights. And so, together with this evolution and the understanding of autonomy, you have the rise of a very anti-individualist understanding of what a liberal society ought to look like. It's a pluralism of groups rather than a pluralism of individuals that then begins to attack the individualist premise of liberalism, associates it with various things like colonialism and patriarchy and the like. So this then means that in both respects, both on the right and the left, you have a interpretation of liberalism that ceases to be liberal, that it does not, on the right you create an economic order that privileges certain people, that creates, grave social inequalities, and on the left you have an interpretation of liberalism that denies the fundamental individualist egalitarian premise on which liberalism is based and argues in favor of the rights of groups instead. And this in turn provokes a reaction on the part of the right. I mean, the left-wing interpretation, well, both of these extremes provoke backlashes. So economic neoliberalism produces a move among many young people around the world back towards socialism, right? This is a word that's now commonly used in American politics by a lot of young people who say they want socialism, not having lived through real socialism, but they don't like the inequality that's been produced in our recent experience of a globalized economy. And then on the left, this understanding of autonomy being based on the rights of groups and kind of unlimited moral freedom provokes a backlash on the part of people that are still embedded in traditional religious cultures or believe in a more traditional form of moral order. And that's the world that we're in right now, where you have both of these groups attacking the liberal center. So I'm just going to speak very briefly just as an American, because I know that this disease hasn't hit Europe in quite the same way as it has the United States. Right now, American liberalism is threatened from both the right and the left, and there's a big argument as to which of these threats is bigger. I think that the most immediate threat comes from the right. It comes from the populist right, because many conservatives in the United States have convinced themselves that they cannot stay in power if the United States remains a democracy in which you have a principle of one person, one vote. because they see themselves as a declining majority, and therefore they are busy trying to change the electoral rules such that they can stay in power even if they begin to lose popular elections. That was certainly Donald Trump's intention. Last November, he's continued to insist that he won the election despite the fact that there really is no credible evidence that he did. And he's gotten many other Republicans to believe that. And I think we are headed towards a very severe constitutional crisis. It'll begin in the midterm election next year, but it'll be particularly severe in 2024 because you could get a Republican elected who loses the popular vote by a very substantial margin, and yet because of this manipulation of the electoral process is elected president. And that opens the door to violence, to a lot of very unpleasant, futures for the United States. The power that's held on the left is different. It's not overtly political, it's more cultural. And teaching at a university, you can see this very powerfully that, I would say that on the right, there are certain kinds of diversity that is resisted. So the right resists the fact that white people in the United States are becoming a smaller part of the population. That's why they don't like immigration. They think that that's shifting the ethnic and racial identity of the country. On the left, you have a different kind of intolerance. They only like diversity related to gender, race, and ethnicity. They don't like diversity when it comes to politics. And therefore, you get very intolerant campuses in which certain political views simply cannot be expressed because it doesn't conform to the orthodoxy of present-day progressives. And both of these are highly illiberal. I think the immediate threat comes from the right, but there's a longer-term threat in terms of the way the culture has shifted in recent years that is also going to undermine belief in liberalism. So that's it. I mean, that's why I wrote this book. I think that if you go back to an earlier understanding of liberalism, it is compatible with a welfare state that equalizes outcomes, and that's something I think that needs to be done. But it's also compatible with a lot of traditional moral frameworks. It should be not an enemy of religion. It should be compatible with the free exercise of religion, which is the way that the American founding fathers understood freedom of religion. It's not freedom from religion, but a freedom to exercise religion. And all of those are possible within a classical liberal framework. I think that that's the way we understood liberalism not that many years ago, and I think that's the understanding to which we need to return now.
I have a very simple question for you. You mentioned during our talks earlier today and yesterday that Trump might be re-elected after Biden. And my question is that, do you basically support the decision of Facebook and Twitter to block Trump? And what do you think of the growing influence of social media that they basically now censor? They can censor anything and everyone. And they they have recently assumed the role of that originally belonged to the states.
Well, you're pointing to a really big problem because it's very hard to have a liberal society if you don't have a basic understanding of facts, if you don't have an agreement about facts. Liberalism accepts the fact that our values are going to be different and that there's value pluralism. As I said, that was why you have liberalism in the first place. People couldn't agree about these deep things that religion speaks to. But, you would agree on the truth of a scientific, experiment or, the conclusions of science as it evolves and so forth. And now we've reached this point where we can't agree on that sort of thing because there's a belief that facts themselves and people that speak in the name of science really have other agendas. So in the United States, we have this big anti-vaccination movement that believes that vaccinations are being driven by a kind of government conspiracy. that is feeding us false information because the government wants to control us, and they're going to control us through giving us, vaccines. In the book, I actually trace the history of this kind of conspiratorial thinking, and I actually do think it begins on the left. That beginning with the rise of structuralist thinkers like Ferdinand de Saussure and then Jacques Derrida, whom I studied with, by the way, in Paris back in the 1970s, and other postmodernist thinkers, culminating in Michel Foucault, you had a critique of modern natural science, in which, and Foucault, in his biopower theorizing, was really the one that was the most responsible for formulating it this way. He argued that science is not objective, that people used to exercise power overtly. They'd kill you or put you in jail, but today they control you by language, by putting forward supposedly neutral scientific observations that actually are means of controlling you, and that's why language becomes extremely important. And it is a kind of conspiratorial way of thinking, which has now drifted from the progressive postmodernist left to a right that thinks that modern science is also trying to control us. But to get to your question about technology, it is made possible both on the left and the right because essentially the elites have lost control not just of the master narrative regarding values, but it's lost control even of the empirical narrative concerning facts. So who won the November 2020 election in the United States? If you go on the internet and you type that question into a Google search bar, you'll get 10,000 hits of people asserting that the election was fraudulent. Similarly with vaccines, you say, what's the evidence that vaccines are dangerous? And again, you'll get 10,000 references to people that are saying that. And so I think the situation we're in is really a very difficult one, where it's not just value relativism, it's epistemic relativism about some basic facts. And if you cannot agree about the factual basis on which you make policy, you're going to end up in situations like we have now, where there's simply a large number of citizens that don't believe the same things that you believe about what happened in the last election. And I don't see how you can have a liberal democracy under those conditions. What you do about it, we can discuss, because it's a very hard policy problem to solve.
Do you see some, difference as liberalism was understood, let's say 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and how it's understood now? Because, look, in your essay, you are mentioning Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, but then, for example, you are mentioning Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and, I would rather say, of course, John Stuart Mill, I would certainly mention Adam Smith, I would mention Ricardo as the economist, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I don't know, I would, so what would be your response, the understanding of liberalism now and the understanding in the past? That's just a change of my age, or there is something more?
No, that's exactly what I was arguing, is that both on the left and the right, liberalism has been reinterpreted. So classical economic liberalism became neoliberalism. If you go back to Adam Smith, he wrote a really important book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he basically argued that human beings are moral creatures that are embedded in societies, and they had social obligations, quite apart from maximizing their, incomes and behaving as rational actors. And that social side was really rejected by, the Chicago school and a lot of people that took those economic ideas to extremes and, as I said, denigrated the role of the state and the like. And exactly, what you said was my argument on the left, that the basic belief in human autonomy was absolutized autonomy was raised above, the actual moral frameworks that had defined the limits of autonomy and were, made the sole end of liberal rights protection. Rousseau, that's a different story. I mean, I think that Rousseau was a liberal in the sense that he did believe in universal human equality and he believed in individuals. He played this extremely important role in the, at least the Western understanding of rights, because he located rights in that interior person. And that was very important for the modern understanding of identity, that identity is not something that is defined by the society around us, it's defined by our inner being, and it's really the society that blocks us from expressing that authentic inner being. And much of the social revolutions that have happened in the succeeding 200 years have been assertions of that inner authentic being against the social constraints that societies pose. And so, is that liberal or not? Well, it may not lead to liberal outcomes in many cases, but it's certainly very modern. It's a very modern understanding of the relationship between the inner self and the valorization of the inner self and the need for social, norms and rules.
And this development on the right side, when you said that it's attacked or from the right and it's even more dangerous than from the left. To what extent this reaction, let's say, on the right, is the reaction to, is a challenge to classical liberalism, and as we understand it, and to what extent is a simply reaction to the fact that the liberalism, as we understood it, was hijacked by the left?
It's both. I think, to be fair, on the right there are probably less thoroughgoing critiques of the underlying theory of liberalism, although a number of conservatives in the United States have been toying with the idea that actually authority, hierarchy, needs to be brought back in some overt form, that democracy may actually not be the best, form of government. I think that the critique of the underlying liberal principles is probably more thoroughgoing on the left. So a lot of progressives, at least in the United States, really don't believe in freedom of speech any longer. They think it's perfectly legitimate to silence somebody that doesn't agree with them. And so you don't really quite see that to the same extent on the right, but both of them are reacting against each other. And that's part of the motive for the polarization that we see, is that the two extremes, bounce off of each other and then they become more extreme as a result.
We still are used to name the people and the movement and the ideas the same way as it was used to do some times ago. We see the communists, we see the socialists, we see the conservatives and liberals. And from time to time, I think that we are, I don't know how to express it, simply the question, why do you think in the United States the people do not name the same way those movements, those ideas as we do? Why do they name socialists as a liberals and so on?
I think there's a historical answer to that question, which has to do with the fact that the United States never had true conservatives in the European sense. People who were rooted to a certain piece of territory that believed in, cultural, very deeply rooted cultural or national traditions that, regarded religious belief as key to their identity. Most conservatives in the United States, in European terms, were actually liberals. Most conservatives actually believed in the free market, they believed in competition, they believed in, the fact that you could remake yourself, if you were an entrepreneur. And so you never had that understanding of conservatives. So therefore, when an American uses the term conservative, they're actually referring to a pro-free market liberal. So that's one source. The thing about socialism, I just think, is a matter of generational turnover, because, you know, I think we lived through the same period when you actually had societies that thought that they were socialist and owned the means of production, tried to abolish private property. When somebody like, one of our progressive politicians uses the word socialism in the United States, they basically mean some form of social democracy. They don't want to abolish private property. They just want to regulate the free market. They want to raise taxes. They want to have extensive social protection. So they want to look more like Sweden or Norway, you know, and that's what they mean by socialism. But because they're 25 years old, they, you know, they don't have all the negative associations with socialism. On the right, you get this really weird, I mean, Donald Trump has been doing this a lot lately, where something that would be considered basically social democracy in Europe, he calls communist. You know, so if you want a national health care system, a mandatory national health care system, that's communism. You know, so it's just a kind of American provincialism where, because we're disconnected with these European traditions, we just have different names for the same phenomenon.
If you can go more into the crystal ball of the American society, so you have already touched the midterm elections and the potential of the next presidential elections and the rift. Is it gonna be ever more growing rift between the fringes on the left and right, ending in a civil war, to put it into an extreme, or what it would take the center to regain the strength?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question, because I can draw up scenarios for both of those outcomes. If you want the scary scenario, you know, what's been going on in the United States is that the outcomes of elections have increasingly been decorrelated with the popular vote. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is just the American constitutional system that gives all states 2 senators. It means that because most of the small states that have small populations tend to vote Republican, the Republicans get overrepresented in the Senate. And then on a state level, they've been gerrymandering the districts so that, you know, they've concentrated the Democratic vote in big cities and therefore limited the number of representatives that they get and also the number of electoral seats. And if that distinction becomes too great, you know, where the Democrats win a really overwhelming proportion of the popular vote and yet the Republicans hold on, but even worse, if the Republicans stay in power because of their manipulation of the voting system, then that could lead to real violence. You know, you'll have big demonstrations in every big city across the country, and then you have all these armed people on the right that want to counter the demonstrators, and you could have people shooting each other. I mean, I don't think you'll end up with a civil war, but you can have a very, very unpleasant situation that will take a long time to get resolved. That's one scenario. There's another scenario where actually the basic demographics in the United States does not look good for conservatives, or at least Trump's version of conservatism, because most of his voters tend to be older. They tend to live in declining areas of the country. They tend to be less educated, and as the country becomes more urban, more educated, as you know, younger voters become more dominant in the society, they're going to be less and less influential, and eventually they may cease to be as powerful a social force. There's several things that complicate that. One is that it's not clear that people are voting just on these demographic characteristics. One of the things that was remarkable about the 2020 election, and also the elections that were held yesterday, I mean, we had a couple of important governor's races and the like, is that the Republicans are getting large turnout in minority groups. African Americans, Hispanics especially, are voting Republican, despite all of the nasty things that Donald Trump has said about, racial and ethnic minorities. And that, to me, indicates that a lot of those people are not voting necessarily for Trump and that nationalistic version of conservatism. They're voting against the left, and it's against precisely the things that you're referring to. They don't like this, very progressive understanding of identity politics, and this hypersensitivity to words and to political correctness and these cultural things that have been a big part of the political argument. And if that's the case, then the Republicans could actually hold on to power legitimately for a long period, unless the Democrats adjust their agenda and stop emphasizing these cultural issues and then go back to more economic inequality kinds of concerns, which I think are more genuinely popular. So all of that's a long way of saying I have no idea what the answer to your question is, because I can imagine any one of those scenarios actually unfolding in the United States, and I don't pretend to see into the future to be able to predict which one is more likely.
I have plenty of friends in the United States. None of them is just a typical liberal or conservative. Just everyone is a mixture. But when you describe this good old liberalism, all of them, they are part of this intellectual current. But they are not represented in the current, they feel not represented in the current American debate. Why liberalism is not able to create this strong, political force which can represent people like my friends? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that part of the problem is a lot of liberals like the ones you're describing are intimidated because there's a lot of momentum behind the more extreme voices that then denounce, somebody that holds a kind of classical liberal position as being racist or sexist or something else. There's this interesting thing that happened at Princeton where there was a statement that was signed by, a few hundred Princeton professors denouncing racism and patriarchy and so forth. And then when the journalists started interviewing the people that had signed the letter, a lot of them said, well, I actually didn't believe this, but I just felt that I had to sign it because that was kind of the tone on campus that was set by the more extreme people that were intimidating, a lot of the people that were less committed. But I think that could change. I think that, that's kind of the reason I'm writing this book, as I want to tell these people it's okay to say that I'm a liberal, I believe in freedom of speech, I believe in, individual rights, and I'm not apologetic about that because you just haven't seen, strong defenses of that position in the political debate recently. And I think there will be a tipping point where at a certain point, if enough people stand up to defend these classical liberal values, then people will look around and they'll say, oh, this person, that person says that, and they're proud to be liberal and so forth. So I guess it's okay to say that publicly, in my own name. At least that's what I'm hoping will happen. I'll just give you one example of this. Among the identity groups that are the most militant is right now the transgender activists. And, so I think any classical liberal would say you should not discriminate against transgender people, that you should treat them equally, that, discrimination exists and, that's really not right in a liberal society. But there's an ideology that has gone together with that movement, which, for example, denies that there is any connection between gender and biological sex. And for a lot of the activists, even to use the term biological sex is, regarded as transphobic. My personal opinion is that this is a ridiculous position, that, biological sex for the vast majority of human beings throughout human history has actually been determinative of a very important, aspect of their identity. It's not true for everybody, but to say that that is intolerable, but to assert that in many academic settings in the United States would be regarded as an act of aggression or transphobic opinion. And many people have been chased out of their positions. We'll see. I have tenure at Stanford, so I don't think they can do that to me. But I think it's changing. The Economist, had an entire issue that was devoted to this, where they took a very strong stand arguing against this, giving very rational arguments. And I do think that at a certain point, some of the less tenable positions that have been taken, by illiberal people will be recognized as such, and there might be this tipping point that'll come where people say, well, actually it is okay to express this opinion that I believe in any event, and I was just scared to be the only one, to be putting that forward.
Why do you think it is France which seems to be the most resistant, if you will, against this new cultural leftism or progressivism or wokeism, whatever you want to call it? And indeed, President Macron has already positioned himself as a kind of crusader against the woke. What is it in the national identity of the French which differs them so much from the Anglo-Saxon or Anglophone world? Is it the more universalist take on the national identity?
Well, of course, it's the French that imposed postmodernism on us. And so it's kind of their fault that we have these doctrines in American universities. I was an undergraduate at Cornell when this hit in the early 1970s, because Foucault and Julia Kristeva and Barthes and all these people came to visit. And at that time, we thought that this was the greatest thing that we'd ever seen, this intellectual revolution coming from France. But then in subsequent years, postmodernism died off in France. And I think it's just, the reason that they have not succumbed to a lot of this is because of that Republican tradition, that part of their national identity has been, the adoption of these Republican ideals of citizenship that were not, that were universalistic, and that continues to be a tradition. In France, there is a danger, however, that there is woke progressivism in France that has been chipping away at that original understanding of citizenship. And one of the things that the National Front, or that the populist right in France has done, is to try to grab that Republican position on citizenship and universal citizenship and try to identify it with the far right. And I think that a lot of French liberals have ceded too much ground to them. They're the ones that ought to be occupying that territory. But you're right, compared to the United States, they're much more willing to believe in this kind of classical form of Republican citizenship than Americans are.
The US and China, two biggest strategic competitors right now in the world. And I still believe that China is less liberal than the US, no matter how we define the word liberal. How is this strategic rivalry going to end up? Have you got any prediction?
Well, I believe that China is the single biggest threat to liberalism and democratic government in the world today. Because they're big, they're successful, they seem to be stable, and they are definitely not liberal. And they become less and less liberal with every passing year. And I think that in foreign policy, unlike previous Chinese administrations, they are now willing to project that power and their model outwards in a way that they had not been willing to earlier. How that's going to evolve? Well, I think that there is going to be a much more competitive relationship between the United States and China going forward. I think that's inevitable. I don't think that's the fault of the United States. I think that that's really the way that China has moved ever since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013. And actually, that's one of the points of continuity in American foreign policy between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, that Biden has not reversed, a lot of Trump's positions, in trying to block Huawei, and trying to disentangle American supply chains from what I think had become an excessive dependence on China. I think that the single thing that worries me the most is Taiwan, because Xi Jinping has made clear that he wants to reunify China. He said that this will happen by force if they can't do this peacefully, and it's pretty clear that he wants to do it before he steps down as president. And I think you know, some of the people that have been watching China very closely think that that's going to happen sooner rather than later, meaning like within the next 5 years or so. And if the Chinese launch a military attack on Taiwan, that is going to be one of the most momentous events in the history of American foreign policy, because right now I do not perceive any kind of consensus as to whether the United States will militarily defend Taiwan. Everybody wants to avoid that question and just pretend that that's not an issue that we're going to have to face, but I'm afraid that we are going to have to face it sooner or later. And it used to be a partisan issue where Republicans were much more pro-Taiwan than Democrats, but I think that that's shifted, and neither party really wants to lose a lot of sons and daughters, you know, in the defense of this island, but they also don't want to just concede it to China, and I just really worry what's going to happen, you know, in the future crisis, which I am pretty sure is going to happen over Taiwan.
Many European countries already have a state quota of over 50%. And hence, I would like to ask, in your opinion, do we still have liberal democracies in the first place? And at which point does a liberal democracy start to transform into another system, like an authoritarian democracy or democratic socialism?
Well, I don't think democratic socialism is an alternative system. It's just a variety of liberalism, because I don't think that the size of the state sector by itself is a criteria for whether the state is liberal or not. If you have a rate of taxation and social protections that consumes more than 50% of the economy, but that system has been voted on in free and fair elections and has been done, you know, according to procedurally liberal, you know, actions that are procedurally liberal, it remains a liberal democracy. I don't think it really has to do with, and in fact, I would go further than that. I would say that liberalism by itself, when it's not connected to democracy, is probably not a very stable form of government, because it does tend to privilege people with money and wealth, and it, you know, leads to inequalities that are politically not sustainable. And so every successful liberal society has been a liberal democracy that has done, in some cases, a pretty dramatic degree of wealth redistribution or income redistribution, because I think that's the only way that you can maintain a political consensus in favor of that form of government. So I simply don't believe that the size of the state sector is related to whether it's liberal or not. Now, obviously, if you abolish property rights and say that nobody can own private property, then you're in a different, you know, then you really are not living in a liberal society. But social democracies don't abolish property rights, they just tax people.
My question is as follows. Do you consider it an assault on liberal principles the way states like Michigan or California, or countries like Canada or Australia, has gone about the response to the virus? Thank you.
No. I don't see why what they've done is any assault on liberal principles, whatever. You know, in these public health matters, it's not simply a matter of individual choice whether you take a vaccine or not, because a vaccine has huge positive externalities. And if you are worried about public health, you want everybody to have a vaccine, and you don't want that to be optional. And I think, court systems all over the liberal world have accepted the basic logic of that there are times when individual choice needs to be limited by, an overriding public good. So yes, I think a liberal state, can mandate vaccines. I think that the position that many people on the left has taken about, we need to trust science and simply do what the scientists say is also not quite a right position, because the thing is that science doesn't speak with a single voice and it keeps evolving all the time. And I think part of the frustration with the responses to COVID, like masking and vaccines and social distancing, is that as the science has evolved, the policies and the instructions to populations have kept changing in very frustrating ways. And so, first you social distance, then you can go to restaurants, and then all of a sudden you have to stop going to restaurants and you have to put your mask back on. And I just think that people get, tired of this, and they say, look, the scientists don't know what they're talking about because their advice changes so much. That's actually not a problem with the science, it's just a reflection of the fact that the science evolves, but I think it explains why it's wrong to simply say we ought to simply turn over these decisions to scientists, because, there are other considerations that go into a decision about whether to order a shutdown of a city, for example. But I think that liberal societies have every right to control things that are related to, public good and public health.
Era of the end of history, 1990s, it was marked by the great Western self-confidence. You could feel this self-confidence everywhere, even more than was needed. Now it's entirely different. West is talking, and the guys like Putin or Xi Jinping are occasionally even smiling into our face. So is there any advice, what the short advice, what the West should do? It's A, and B, whether you see some Western politician who would be up to the job to gain the respect. Of course, it's much more difficult because there is the redistribution of the power in the world from the West to the East. So it's much more difficult to be up to the job than in the past. But who is up to the job, and what would be your advice?
Well, the general advice would be that countries that are liberal democracies, first of all, should be defended by their own citizens. So if you are actually a liberal, you should be proud to be a liberal and should vote for politicians that support those liberal values. But there also needs to be an international dimension to this, that countries that are seeking to be liberal democracies should be supported by ones that are better established. There ought to be solidarity in the face of threats to liberal democracy by countries like Russia and China. I am actually quite disappointed by the Biden administration. I voted for Joe Biden, and I still think he's much, much better than any conservative alternative out there. But I was very disappointed that, they backed down on opposition to Nord Stream 2. They don't seem to have been very supportive of Ukraine. There are many other countries that are being threatened by authoritarian leaders that the United States has been silent about, and I think that's a mistake, because if we don't express solidarity, our fellow liberal Democrats in other countries are going to get discouraged and overwhelmed by the authoritarian forces that they face. And I must say, Czech Republic has done very well in that overall struggle, because you have a lot of institutions that are, very powerfully engaged, and, foundations like the one that Jana is running, I think are all part of that same struggle. But I think that's what we need to do and keep up. I don't want to name any specific politicians that I think are going to be saviors, because I think that's the wrong attitude. We all have agency, and we all need to contribute to this effort and not hope for a particular individual that's going to be the one that's really going to turn things around.
Thank you very, very much. Jana, something for the end to tell?
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for coming today, and thank you, Professor Fukuyama.
Thank you for coming.